Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to our Star Wars Legends book club. This month, we will be tackling a story that all of you requested in our latest poll. If you haven't been checking out our community tab, we've been posting polls for nearly all of these types of videos in our series, our tier lists, as well as our Legends book club and even top 10s. We're giving you guys the power to choose what we do. So if you want to interact with us in the community tab, check out all of our polls there. But you guys all chose the Dark Empire trilogy of comic books that came out in the 90s, written by Tom Veitch and penciled by Cam Kennedy. And we are going to be talking about all three of the parts of this trilogy. But before we do so, please hit that like button down below and subscribe to our channel for continued Star Wars content. We are on our way to 1,000 subs, and every single person's like, comment, and subscription will really, really help us out as we get towards there. We appreciate all of you who have supported us throughout the last year and a half or so, and we are looking forward to growing even bigger and talking to even more Star Wars fans. We're going to dive in, and as usual for Legends Book Club, we separate this into three different sections. The first one is going to be kind of our general thoughts, but more so along the lines of the writing and the storytelling here. Sonic, what were your thoughts on the story that's being told and across these three different parts of the trilogy?
I mean, when you think about Dark Empire, I mean, at least for me, I was thinking, okay, it's a story about like how Luke tries to infiltrate using the Force, the dark side with a reborn Emperor, the whole war campaigns waged under the new Dark Empire with the eclipse and all of these things, and then the clone bodies, like yada yada. Like there's so many different parts of that story that you're like, okay, yeah, like that. I can see that you know, being a basis for like a whole trilogy's worth of stories. And then having read it finally, it's like, oh, it's really just the first story. And it's the one that's most iconic, but I think it's pretty easy for a lot of people, including myself, to just assume that's what the whole thing is about. I don't know. I don't think it's really a story that past the first arc or the first Dark Empire has a lot of substance. I can give it credit for trying to do a lot of like galaxy and world building. There's some slight hints of like what eventually becomes the prequels, the beginnings of like the Jedi with like characters like Cam Sullusser, and we see a lot more of like the infighting between Imperials. We get to see like Nar Shaddaa and all these planets be brought up. So I guess we see a lot of the beginnings that have, or obviously much more pronounced by the time of Thrawn trilogy, and this takes place before the trilogy does, so it kind of sets up some things, but it's also just very like a lot. Like it is, like you said, Liam, very 90s. The designs of it are very 90s, but even the story just feels like sometimes they don't even talk as people. They're just doing exposition dumps. I think after the first one, it definitely goes downhill. The Empire's End, you're just like, what, why is this even here? At least I found Dark Empire 2 to at least have some connective tissue to the first one. That I was like, okay, like they're developing characters like Vima and some of these people who are involved with the Imperial War effort. And again, Emperor comes back. Like it's like, okay, we're building off these threads. But by the third, I was like, we've gone over these things over and over again. Like, what is the point of making that trilogy other than the sake of having another Star Wars trilogy of sorts? So an interesting excursion, but I don't think there's many returns from the first one, and there's definitely not a trilogy's worth out of this.
No, this is definitely a long, repetitive story, and you can kind of tell by the release windows of the series as a whole, the fact that they were so spread so far apart. Unlike the Thrawn trilogy was conceived as a trilogy and it came out every year like a trilogy does, but this story 1991, then you have all the way to I think 1995 was the next, it was Dark Empire 2, and then 97 it was conceived because of the popularity of the first part. And like you said, the first part is where all the iconic stuff happens. It's the best stuff, and it's because it was the most novel back when it came out. Like, yes, it does, redo villains like Palpatine, which we've now seen heavily influence the Rise of Skywalker. And there's a lot of elements, and rereading this, there's a lot of elements that kind of surprised me how many things they took for the Rise of Skywalker. But we'll talk about that later in the impact section. But the story being told here, Tom Veitch's Star Wars stuff, I've always been a little hit and miss because I think sometimes the way he just writes comics in general, especially in Star Wars, there's times where there's pages that are like a novel page of dialogue and narration where you're just like, Jesus, how many words can be on this page? And then there's other pages that are just flash pages that have no text, and it's a very odd combination of the two. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily flow. I do think all the best ideas are in part 1. Part 2, I think, is better than part 3. Empires and it just feels so unnecessary. It adds nothing to the story. It ultimately really the only impact is that Abyss is destroyed, but that even felt super out of character for Han Solo to just go and destroy up a planet. It's a story that just feels redundant over and over again, and by the time you get through the end, I do want to focus on part 1 though, because I think that is heavily it's one of the most influential Star Wars stories for a reason, and it is good 90s cheese. It's not anything in depth to the point where you're reading it and you're like, man, I love this for all the layers I'm getting about Star Wars. No, it's not like that. But I think as a piece of Star Wars history, as well as for the ideas that it proposes, and then its solid execution of all of it, I am quite a big fan of the first one. And I thought the same thing reading it a second time. It's just the further parts of the trilogy that start to bring this whole thing down as a whole when you're talking about the entire package, but definitely recommend reading part 1. And like you said, the art especially, I feel like I have such a nostalgic like kick for the art, but mostly it's the coloring, and the coloring is really well done. Cam Kennedy pencils and inks both for his work, but I've never been a huge fan of these pencils either. They're not well defined, and a lot of things just look people in general look very similar to each other. Like every single Imperial looks the same. No, people don't stand out very well. I think there could be a little more definition given to his art, but the color themselves, there's a lot of beautiful looking pages that look excellent in this. Let's move on to the character section, though, of this review, because there are a lot of characters in here, and we can talk about variety of things. But which characters kind of stood out to you throughout the trilogy?
I think top of my head, Cedrus. He was just like 90s crow mixed with punk vibes and leather and spikes, and he's like an executor or something. He's not exactly like an adept. He's apparently a step above. But it was like nice having some more of like the ancient stuff. It's a nice way of bypassing the prequel era by going kind of back. And like it is Tom Veitch, so he probably had some of these ideas brewing right after Dark Empire or during the process of Dark Empire that he went to with Tales of the Jedi. And I think that helped flesh out some of these character motivations, like how thousands of years later, the effects of those conflicts are now showing up in these strange, kind of weird characters that are thrown in and trying to be blended into these post Return of the Jedi era. I mean, Palpatine stands out for me mostly because, like you said, he's almost flanderized in this series. Like it's like why like you keep on doubling down on the same shtick. I do like the Osis characters that like they can't really speak English, but they're like the descendants of the ancient Jedi and stuff, and the Tree Jedi that like sacrifices himself to defeat Cedrus and all that. There were some genuinely cool characters. Just they're cool when they did one or two things and then they disappeared, or they kept on coming back again and again. I was like, okay, well, there's not really much happening here. I don't think the characters as a whole, outside of the original trilogy characters, are a strong suit. I know there's Cam Solis here as like the first real Jedi, and I think it's pretty interesting for him because he has a huge role to play here as like a supporting Jedi, but he doesn't really interact too much with Leia. It's mostly with Luke, but he just doesn't get development. He's just there, kind of just walking with Luke. I don't know. For an original Jedi that's being developed at this time that isn't crazy or mad like Jorah Scabat the clone or Luke the clone in the Thrawn trilogy, I was hoping for something a little bit more because then the rest of Legends, as far as I recall, kind of ignores him. Like he's just there. He's not really prominent. And for being like the first real student of Luke's Jedi Academy in Legends, I don't know. Dark Empire 2 and 3 definitely had opportunity to do more with him, and he's just I don't know, he doesn't develop at all. So I guess that's like my whole summary of characters. A lot of cool things that happen with them, but nothing rich about them, nothing that like makes you say like these characters can stand toe to toe with some of the original trilogy characters.
Yeah, I think the character section really could be the shortest of this review because, like you said, the original trilogy cast is the heart and soul of this. They're the ones on the cover. They're the ones that are heavily participating, especially Luke. But Leia and Han serve their role as well. And it's really the Luke and Palpatine stuff that you are here for. Like that is done well in the first one, especially, and it's thing that continues to be done pretty well throughout the whole thing. Palpatine definitely becomes a parody of himself. He becomes, so maniacally crazy and strange that by the end it's like, I love cheesy, goofy Palpatine, but by the end you're just like, okay, I'm ready for this whole thing to be over when it's done 3 times. But again, the first part works really really well, and I think a lot of the positives and most of the negatives are like that separation of the first versus the second and third because of its redundancy. But I do dig the look they gave Luke. Like it's an iconic look, and I remember the Power of the Force 2 line toy for that character and just always really loving that and thinking it was really cool before I read the book. And then now having, read it a couple times and really getting to feast on that, especially I got the Epic collection of this and the colors are a little digitally enhanced and redone and it looks great. I think it all looks really nice. So I would say Luke for me is definitely the standout. Cam, like you said, I think is the best new character that we've gotten, but everybody is still sidelined for Luke and for Leia and for Han. And that's kind of what we expect. In 1991, we get new Star Wars content. This was supposed to kickstart Star Wars in the comics. And doing that, they needed to latch on to stuff we knew. So here we go. We got our original trilogy characters. And I think this is a nice springboard for a lot of other things that ultimately get more expanded upon in future stuff. It's a 90s comic, and 90s comics weren't really intent on giving us great characters. They were intent on giving us flashy, cool splash pages. And this does that. So the final section we have to talk about, though, is impact on Star Wars history. The Dark Empire trilogy has, out of anything we've read so far for our Legends Book Club, the most impact out on Star Wars. It was both the springboard for Star Wars comics, again, post Marvel, but also just its more recent obvious impact with The Rise of Skywalker. What were some of your takeaways with the impact this book has had on Star Wars post its release?
Well, it takes a lot of like swings. Like I think a big thing that really stood out to me is like the amount of tech, the amount of designs that it just throws out there. And it's kind of telling that most of them don't ever really show up again. They're like mentioned in books and stuff, but there's very few that don't happen. Like I think an interesting one was like the robotic ties from the very beginning of Empire's End. Like okay, whatever. But then there's stuff like the World Devastators that are in the 2003 Clone Wars. So there's some ideas that clearly hit like iconically visually. I will say the impact in from an Imperial's perspective is like it really did flesh out these conflicts that were constantly happening and how it would look like. I think at the end of the day, you'll have so many stories that are like, described in books about Imperial warlords kind of fighting each other, but we don't really get a taste of what that could look like here. We get to see a lot of that, and we get to see like the different technologies that they'd use against each other. And I think that definitely helped flesh out the Legends idea of like everyone already has like a trick card up their sleeve. The Jedi stuff is pretty good here. I will give it that. Ossus being like one of the original ancient Jedi homes, like that's really cool. The Old Republic and Knights of the Old Republic really developed that place. So having read that and played through that stuff, like being able to kind of attach it here, I was like, okay, yeah, like it's not exactly what I thought it'd be, but still, Tom Veitch was still involved. I can see like the beginnings of what it'd be. It kind of establishes like other books have done it, but like the fact that like Luke could just stumble amongst a group of people, showcases amazing ability in the Force, and then they're like, "Yeah, we'll come join you." Like that was a huge thing in Legends. Like they'd always be super confident, or like would be like so scared of him. He does something with the Force, and they're like, I trust you with my life, Luke. The biggest thing still at the end of the day comes down with Dark Empire, with the cloning, with Emperor coming back. I think it's pretty interesting that they keep him young here and Rise of Skywalker. He's leaning a bit more into like the the arm rig, the whole body rig that's in Tales of the Jedi. But sometimes it's hard to even gauge the impact because they throw so many ideas out there that you're just like, oh, that I remember that. It happened like 4 issues ago, and you've just seen that repeated, something else repeated like 5 times, and you're just like, ugh, what did I just read through? So even visually, some of the cooler concepts, big swings, didn't come into canon or further than Legends. But the ones that did were like, wow, those are iconic. I remember them every single time.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the Palpatine stuff in general is definitely the most impactful for today's world. But Ossus too is a good call as well. And Veitch is really his whole work in the early '90s with Tales of the Jedi, and this did lay the foundation for stuff like KOTOR that ultimately did set an impactful future for an entire era of Star Wars that was basically discovered from, a couple different people's brains. Like they all laid the foundation for it between Veitch and then Carpathian later. It was all out of the same brain trust. But then seeing how much of the Palpatine clone stuff, the fact that his bodies are decaying, all of that type of stuff was included in the Rise of Skywalker. The fact that he's trying to create some type of perfect vessel, but he can't find one, and his dark side energy is kind of taking over, and he needs to put his spirit into another person's body, which ultimately he tries to make Rey or Kylo Ren. There's a lot of different parts of this that were directly influenced, and even like the tech side as well, but also the fact that Biss is kind of like you could kind of say it's reminiscent of Exegol in the way they're building all this technology on this place that's an ancient Sith place that all the nobody's seen before, and then now they're going to attack it. I believe at one point too there's like even one master ship that's controlling all the ships from rising to there's stuff like that that's
Yeah.
like directly influenced the plot of the Rise of Skywalker. Ossus has become a big part of current canon as well, being the location of Luke's Jedi Temple. It was big in Shadow of the Sith as well. So there's a lot of stuff here that it really makes you appreciate this story, even if it's not like going to live up to your lofty expectations of all the excitement and praise this thing has gotten over the years. This is not the best written comic book, but it's an enjoyable piece of Star Wars history. You can go, oh, well, that's where this came from, and I think that's my favorite part of this. So now getting into the review or score for this whole thing, Sonic, what are your final thoughts, and how would you rank this series?
Dark Empire 1 is really the only thing that has a story of substance, and it takes a lot of shortcuts too, especially with just how Luke just goes into Palpatine's palace from the start, and then he's already like working um, to destroy the dark side from within. And you're just like it's a story that takes leaps. Dark Empire 1, despite its flaws, is good. It's very serviceable. It did take a lot of leaps. It's just I wish it was like a story that could have been spread over a trilogy instead of just crammed to like 7 or 8 issues. So I'd give Dark Empire 3 out of 5.
And I think that's a completely fair score. If I was to rate Dark Empire, I think I would rate it higher than you did personally, just because I love the historical aspect of this. And this is comicified Star Wars with post Dark Knight Returns and stuff like that and Watchmen, and now you've got this. I think because of the trappings and like the way it all feels and the importance of the history, I would actually give this first part a 3.5 out of 5.
Yeah, Dark Empire 2 is just let's throw every storyline out there that was like slightly touched upon or hinted at in the first one and then let it run its course. It definitely feels like it's been 4 years between this one and the first one, and you can tell because they're just throwing Palpatine back, and he's sillier than ever, and he should be the glue. He should be at least what keeps the villainy of the story focused, but he just pops in and out, and you focus on characters like Cedrus, like the Imperial interconflicts. The biggest thing I enjoyed about two is that well, it's not really a competent story. It has so many unique concepts, like the Ossus stuff. Still, Like, when I think about it more and more, it's like having that living, like, tree-like Jedi, having these descendants of Jedi who know it more like a mythology than in, like, a real practice. That stuff is cool. I don't love stuff like the Galaxy missile gun or whatever it's called. Like, some things are just like, "Alright, now you're just falling into the trap that even sometimes like something like a Starkiller Base does," but at least Starkiller Base felt like a step up instead of, like, just a quantum leap, and this is before Star Crusher or Sun Crusher and all these other crazy, Empire stuff that's created in Legends. Yeah, so I guess as an overall score, 2.5. It's not great for me. It's just a lot of just stuff thrown together with no sense of continuity or connection for me.
Dark Empire 2 was one the first time I read it. I had a hard time getting through it. I read both of them back to back, which is a big mistake the same day. But Dark Empire 2 is both very redundant, but also, like you said, quite scattered. But ultimately, it is kind of the art and the continuation of the story that makes it the most interesting and most desirable to continue with. Rating it is tough because I don't necessarily think it's like disastrous, but I would probably give Dark Empire 2 a 2.5. Also, I think it's a significant step down from the first one. Okay, so now Empire's End. How would you rate the concluding chapter?
I look at it, I look at these pages, and then even if the line work seems a little bit better, and I feel like I'm more invested in the story, there's nothing that matters here other than Palpatine trying to go into Anakin Solo at this point, or I guess he's unnamed at this point, and he tries to like take over the body, and you're like, oh, and it doesn't happen. You're like, okay, that's not really the most dynamic thing to see. Here, he's just like a sickly old man. Like, yeah, he is visibly aging too, but like he's mentally ill. Like, there's nothing about him that is anything like the Return of the Jedi Palpatine. There's not really much that I can say here. I'm just gonna give it a two.
That's fair. I think with this one, I have a lot of the same criticisms as you, especially in regards to Palpatine. Palpatine, like, there's the one part in this where he pretends to be like an old man whose like sons are taking him to the place of refuge on Onderon when they're trying to
Yeah.
get Anakin Solo from Leia. That just comes across as such like a Scooby Doo type villain. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
like it just doesn't really work. At the same time, though, this to me, this story is relatively inoffensive. It because it's shorter, but again, because it's shorter, there's a gigantic page of crawl text at the beginning before the book even starts. That's like trying to catch you up on everything that's happened in the Bantam era between Dark Empire 2 and this one, and also what happened in Dark Empire 2. And then even worse, there's an epilogue that's even longer where it's just like explaining everything that happens after this story, but it doesn't give you any comic version of it. Like, we just read a comic, but now we have to read like a novel page to tell you what happens after the story ends. Like, Han throws the missile, or they have the missile shoot into Biss and destroy an entire planet, which I think was weird. I don't think Leia would be okay with that. And then you get an entire page of text like, "This is what happened to Luke after, and this is what happened to Leia after," and it's like, where is all that? Where's the story? I'm gonna give this one a 2.25. I think slightly higher than you, but it wasn't very good. So, anyway, that's our thoughts on the Dark Empire trilogy. Let us know what you think down below in the comments. Do you like this series a little better than us? Is it one of your favorites? We've had a lot of fans of the Dark Empire trilogy, and a lot of our polls, a lot of people seem to really love this material. And I've definitely gotten it recommended to me for a How to Adapt episode as well. And I do want to do one eventually. There is a lot of juicy material there. Probably stick to the first part though. But thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't yet, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. As I said, we're approaching 1,000 subs. Every single one of you will help out. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and give us a like so we can help reach out to all other Star Wars fans and talk Star Wars with everybody else. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.